At a crowded military reunion in San Diego, the atmosphere was thick with stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and honor. Veterans from different generations mingled, sharing war tales over cold beers and warm handshakes. In one corner of the room, a confident young Navy SEAL named Marcus Thompson was holding court, regaling a small group with his recent deployment stories from Afghanistan. His chest was puffed with pride, his voice carrying the swagger that comes with surviving some of the world's most dangerous missions. That's when he noticed her, an elderly woman, probably in her late 80s, sitting quietly at a corner table. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a simple blue dress with a small pin on her collar that caught the light. Something about her calm presence seemed out of place among all the testosterone-fueled storytelling. Marcus, feeling generous and perhaps showing off a bit for his audience, decided to include her in the conversation. "Ma'am," he called out with a patronizing smile, "you seem a little lost. This is a military gathering. Are you here with someone?" The woman looked up with eyes that held depths Marcus couldn't quite read. "I'm exactly where I belong, son," she replied calmly. Marcus chuckled, and his buddies joined in. "Well, we're all sharing war stories here. Which war were you in?" The question dripped with sarcasm, and he expected either embarrassed silence or perhaps a story about her husband's service. The old woman set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. The small pin on her collar caught the light again, and for the first time, Marcus noticed what it was, a French resistance medal, worn and weathered with age. Her reply came in a voice steady as steel. "Ask your granddad about Operation Jedburgh. If he's still alive and man enough to tell you the truth." The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every laugh died, because everyone in that room, except Marcus, suddenly recognized who they were looking at. This wasn't just any elderly woman who'd wandered into their reunion. This was Margaret Maggie Sullivan. And Marcus Thompson was about to learn that some wars are fought in shadows, some heroes never get parades, and some people have earned the right to sit anywhere they damn well please. Margaret Sullivan was born in 1925 in a small farming town in Iowa, where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual corn festival. Her father was a World War I veteran who rarely spoke about his time in the trenches of France, but he did teach his daughter something unusual for girls in those days: how to shoot, how to think strategically, and how to keep her mouth shut when it mattered. Her mother, a schoolteacher, made sure Margaret could speak French as fluently as English, insisting that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from her. Margaret was 17 when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and like millions of other Americans, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. But while her male classmates were enlisting in droves, Margaret found herself in a unique position. She was fluent in French, deadly accurate with a rifle, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that her teachers had noted since she was small. More importantly, she had something that military recruiters were desperately seeking but rarely found: the ability to disappear into a crowd and become completely unremarkable. In 1943, at age 18, Margaret was approached by a man in a gray suit who claimed to be from the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. He had been watching her for months, he said, ever since her French teacher had recommended her for a mysterious language program that turned out to be much more than anyone had imagined. The man, who never gave his real name, explained that America needed young people who could blend in behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. People who could kill if necessary, but, more importantly, people who could think their way out of impossible situations. The training was unlike anything Margaret could have imagined. For 6 months, she learned how to pick locks, forge documents, kill with her bare hands, and, most importantly, how to become someone else entirely. She learned to move through cities without being noticed, to read the subtle signs of danger in a crowd, and to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. Her instructors were men and women who had already survived behind enemy lines, and they taught her that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being the smartest and the most invisible. In the spring of 1944, Margaret was told she had been selected for Operation Jedburgh, a joint mission between American OSS, British SOE, and French resistance fighters. The plan was to drop three-person teams behind German lines in occupied France to coordinate with local resistance groups, gather intelligence, and prepare for the D-Day invasion. Each team consisted of one American or British officer, one French liaison, and one radio operator. Margaret would be all three. The night before her deployment, Margaret's commanding officer took her aside for a final conversation. "Once you step out of that plane," he told her, "you'll be completely on your own. No backup, no rescue mission if things go wrong. If you're caught, the official position is that you don't exist. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "Sir, I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." On June 3rd, 1944, 3 days before D-Day, Margaret Sullivan parachuted into Nazi-occupied France under the code name Nightingale. She was 19 years old, carried nothing but a radio, a pistol, and a small leather bag containing enough false documents to create 3 different identities. Her mission was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. Make contact with a local resistance cell near the town of Chartres, help them coordinate sabotage operations against German supply lines, and, most importantly, stay alive long enough to radio crucial intelligence back to Allied command. What Margaret didn't know as she floated down through the dark French countryside was that her resistance contact had been captured 2 weeks earlier. The Germans knew she was coming, they knew her code name, and they were waiting. The first person she met on the ground wasn't a French resistance fighter. It was a German SS officer who spoke perfect English and had been studying her file for days. "Welcome to France, Miss Sullivan," he said with a cold smile. "We've been expecting you." Margaret's training kicked in before her fear could paralyze her. In one fluid motion, she pulled the cord that would tangle her parachute around the officer's legs, drew her pistol, and put 2 bullets in his chest before he could reach for his weapon. But she could hear vehicles approaching in the distance, and she knew she had perhaps 2 minutes before the entire German garrison would be hunting her through the French countryside. This was the moment that would define not just Margaret Sullivan's war, but her entire understanding of what it meant to serve her country. As she gathered her equipment and melted into the dark forest, she realized that everything she had trained for, everything she thought she knew about warfare, was about to be tested in ways that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. For the next 14 months, Margaret Sullivan would wage a personal war against Nazi Germany that would make her one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the European theater. She would save countless lives, gather intelligence that would change the course of battles, and earn the grudging respect of both allies and enemies. But all of that was still ahead of her as she crouched in the French woods, listening to German search dogs getting closer, and realized that her real war was just beginning. The girl who had left Iowa 18 months earlier was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who would earn the right to sit wherever she pleased and answer to no one except the ghosts of the people she had failed to save along the way. Margaret checked her compass, shouldered her equipment, and began moving deeper into occupied France. Behind her, she could hear the Germans shouting orders and organizing search parties. Ahead of her lay a war that would test every limit she didn't even know she had. She was exactly where she belonged, and she was just getting started. Margaret spent her first week in occupied France learning that survival meant abandoning every assumption she had ever made about warfare. The resistance cell she was supposed to contact was gone, scattered or dead after the German raid that had captured their leader. The safe houses marked on her map had been compromised. Even the basic intelligence about German troop movements that her mission depended on was weeks out of date. She was completely on her own in hostile territory, with a radio she could only use sparingly and documents that might get her shot if they were examined too closely. But Margaret had something her instructors couldn't have taught her, and the Germans couldn't have anticipated, an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. Growing up in a small Iowa town had taught her that everyone had secrets, everyone had reasons for doing what they did, and everyone could be motivated if you found the right pressure point. Within 3 days of her arrival, she had identified and made contact with the scattered remnants of 3 different resistance cells, not by following her briefing materials, but by watching, listening, and trusting her instincts. Her first major operation came when she learned that a German ammunition depot was being used to supply the coastal fortifications that would face the D-Day invasion. The depot was heavily guarded, surrounded by minefields, and considered impregnable by the local resistance fighters who had been watching it for months. Margaret studied the facility for 2 days before she realized that the German strength was also their weakness. They were so confident in their security that they had become predictable. Every morning at exactly 6:15, a French work crew was escorted into the depot to perform maintenance on the buildings. The crew was searched going in and coming out, but Margaret noticed something the guards had missed. The French workers were required to bring their own tools, and those tools were only inspected visually. Working with a blacksmith in the nearby village who had lost his son to German execution, Margaret spent 3 nights creating hollow hammer handles that could each hold enough plastic explosive to level a building. The morning of the operation, Margaret disguised herself as one of the work crew, having convinced the crew leader to allow her to take the place of his sick nephew. She walked past German guards who had been hunting her for a week, carrying enough explosives to destroy their entire ammunition supply, hidden in plain sight in the tools she would need to do her supposed job. Once inside the depot, Margaret had exactly 4 hours to place her charges and get out before the crew was searched and escorted back to town. But as she began her work, she discovered something that changed everything. The depot wasn't just storing ammunition for coastal defenses. Hidden in the deepest bunkers were stockpiles of chemical weapons that the Germans were planning to use against Allied invasion forces. Margaret realized she wasn't just looking at a tactical target. She was looking at something that could turn D-Day into a massacre. The problem was that her small charges weren't sufficient to destroy the chemical weapons safely. If she simply detonated them, she would create a toxic cloud that would kill everyone in the surrounding villages, including the people she was trying to protect. But if she left the chemicals intact, they would be used against Allied soldiers who were already loading onto ships in England, preparing for the invasion that was now just hours away. Margaret made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She reset her charges to create a smaller explosion that would damage the depot's communication equipment and main ammunition stores, but leave the chemical weapons intact. Then, she slipped away from the work crew and spent the next 18 hours stalking the depot's commanding officer, a colonel named Klaus Weber who had earned a reputation for both tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. Weber was scheduled to inspect the chemical weapons at dawn, following his daily routine that Margaret had been studying for days. She waited in his private quarters, having picked the lock and disabled the guard outside his door. When Weber returned from his evening rounds, Margaret was sitting in his chair, her pistol trained on his chest, looking for all the world like she belonged there. "Colonel Weber," she said in perfect German, "we need to have a conversation about your chemical weapons." What followed was a negotiation unlike anything either of them had ever experienced. Weber was a professional soldier who understood that he had been outmaneuvered by someone far more skilled than he had anticipated. Margaret was a 19-year-old farm girl who was essentially blackmailing one of the most dangerous men in occupied France. But both of them understood that they were discussing the fate of thousands of people, and both of them were professional enough to treat the conversation with the seriousness it deserved. Margaret's proposition was simple. Weber would arrange for the chemical weapons to be transferred to a facility near Paris, where they would be safely stored until after the invasion. In exchange, Margaret would provide him with information about Allied invasion plans that would allow him to redeploy his forces more effectively. It was a lie, of course. The information Margaret shared was carefully crafted disinformation that would actually help the Allied invasion, but it was convincing enough to give Weber a face-saving reason to agree to her terms. The negotiation lasted until dawn, and when it was over, Margaret had accomplished something that military historians would later call one of the most significant intelligence operations of the war. Not only had she prevented the use of chemical weapons against Allied forces, but she had manipulated the German command structure into weakening their own defensive positions. But the personal cost was enormous. As Margaret walked away from Weber's headquarters, she knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had looked into the eyes of her enemy and found him to be not a monster, but simply another soldier doing what he thought was right for his country. She had lied to him, manipulated him, and ultimately betrayed him, even though he had kept his word and probably saved thousands of lives by doing so. That morning, as the first reports of the D-Day invasion began filtering through German communication networks, Margaret transmitted her final intelligence report from occupied France. The chemical weapons had been secured, the depot's ammunition stores were severely damaged, and German defensive positions had been compromised in ways that would significantly aid the Allied advance. Her mission was complete, but Margaret Sullivan, the Iowa farm girl, was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more cynical, but also more determined than she had ever imagined possible. Someone who understood that the real war wasn't fought with armies and tanks, but with information, manipulation, and the willingness to sacrifice pieces of your own soul for the greater good. Someone who had earned the right to sit wherever she pleased and answer to no one except the people whose lives depended on her willingness to do what others couldn't or wouldn't do. As she prepared to make her way back to Allied lines, Margaret looked back at the German depot one last time. Somewhere in that facility, Colonel Weber was probably wondering if he had just been outmaneuvered by one of the most dangerous operatives he had ever encountered, or if he had simply been lucky enough to meet someone who understood that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make sure that everyone survives it. Margaret's success with the chemical weapons depot had earned her something she didn't want: attention from both Allied command and German intelligence. Within a week of D-Day, she received new orders through her encrypted radio contact. Instead of returning to Allied lines as planned, she was to remain in occupied France and coordinate with advancing Allied forces to identify high-value German assets that could be captured or eliminated. What the orders didn't mention was that German counterintelligence had finally realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than a typical OSS operative. Colonel Weber, despite their agreement, had provided his superiors with a detailed analysis of Margaret's methods and capabilities. The Germans now knew they were hunting someone who could think like them, speak like them, and disappear among them almost at will. They assigned their best agent to find her, a woman named Ingrid Richter, who had spent 3 years infiltrating resistance networks across Europe. Margaret spent the summer of 1944 playing a deadly game of cat and mouse across the French countryside as Allied forces advanced and German units retreated. Her mission had evolved from simple intelligence gathering to something far more complex. She was now tasked with identifying German officers who had knowledge of Nazi war crimes, documenting evidence of atrocities, and, when possible, ensuring that key witnesses survived to testify after the war. This new mission brought her into contact with aspects of the Nazi regime that her training had never prepared her for. In a small village near Rouen, she discovered a detention facility where German officers had been conducting medical experiments on French civilians. In a forest outside Cannes, she found mass graves containing the bodies of resistance fighters who had been tortured for information before being executed. Most devastating of all, she began to understand that the war crimes weren't aberrations committed by rogue officers. They were systematic policies implemented at the highest levels of German command. Margaret's response to these discoveries revealed something about her character that even she hadn't fully understood. Rather than simply documenting the crimes and moving on, she began taking direct action to prevent them. When she learned that a convoy of political prisoners was being transported to a concentration camp, she didn't wait for orders or backup. She organized an ambush that freed 37 people, including 2 former French government officials whose testimony would later be crucial in war crimes trials. When German forces began executing French civilians in reprisal for resistance activities, Margaret abandoned her low profile entirely. She spent 2 weeks systematically eliminating the officers responsible, using methods that were both brutal and precisely calculated to send a message to their replacements. She wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore. She had become a one-woman psychological warfare operation designed to make German officers afraid to commit atrocities because they never knew who might be watching. It was during this period that Margaret first encountered Ingrid Richter, though neither woman initially knew who the other was. Margaret had been tracking a German captain who was responsible for organizing the execution of French civilians when she noticed she was being followed by someone whose technique was almost as good as her own. For 3 days, Margaret and Ingrid circled each other through the streets of a small French town, each trying to determine if the other was a threat, an ally, or simply an innocent bystander. The confrontation came in a bombed-out church on the outskirts of town. Margaret had chosen the location carefully, multiple exits, good sight lines, and enough debris to provide cover if shooting started. She arrived early and positioned herself in the choir loft, watching the entrances and waiting to see who would follow her. When Ingrid entered the church, Margaret immediately recognized her as the person who had been tracking her for days. "You can come down now," Ingrid called in accented but fluent French. "We both know why we're here." Margaret kept her pistol trained on the woman below as she descended from the choir loft. At close range, she could see that Ingrid was probably in her late 20s, with the kind of unremarkable features that made her perfect for undercover work. She was also armed, though she made no move toward her weapon. "You're very good," Ingrid continued in German, switching languages to test Margaret's reaction. "But you've been making mistakes lately. Emotional decisions. That's not like you. And you would know this how?" Margaret replied in German, her accent perfect enough to make Ingrid pause. "Because I've been studying you for months. Every operation, every decision, every method you use. You're the most effective operative I've ever encountered, but you're starting to lose your objectivity. That makes you dangerous, not just to your enemies, but to yourself and to the people you're trying to protect." What followed was one of the strangest conversations of Margaret's life. Two women, each trained to kill the other, discussing the ethics of warfare and the psychological toll of operating behind enemy lines. Ingrid revealed that she wasn't just hunting Margaret. She had been assigned to study Margaret's methods and adapt them for German intelligence operations. But the more she had learned about Margaret's work, the more she had begun to question her own mission. "Do you know what your government calls you in their reports?" Ingrid asked. "Der Nachtschatten, the shadow of night." There are German officers who would rather face an Allied tank battalion than spend a week in territory where you've been operating. You've become something they didn't think was possible. A single person who can change the outcome of military operations through pure psychological warfare. Margaret absorbed this information while keeping her pistol trained on Ingrid, but she was beginning to understand that this wasn't going to end in violence. Both women were professionals who had recognized something in each other that went beyond national loyalties or military orders. They were both trying to serve their countries while maintaining something that resembled a moral code, and both of them were discovering that the two goals weren't always compatible. The conversation ended when Allied artillery began shelling the area, forcing both women to seek shelter in the church's basement. They spent the next 6 hours crammed into a small storage room, listening to explosions overhead and gradually sharing information about their respective missions, their training, and their growing uncertainty about what would happen when the war ended. By the time the shelling stopped, Margaret had made a decision that would have profound consequences for both women. She offered Ingrid something that intelligence operatives were never supposed to consider: the chance to change sides, not to betray German military secrets or provide intelligence to the Allies, but to help ensure that the evidence of war crimes Margaret had been collecting would reach the proper authorities after the war ended. Ingrid's response revealed something about her character that surprised even Margaret. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 2 years, she said quietly. "The hardest part has been pretending that I still believe in what my country is doing." When they finally emerged from the church basement, Margaret and Ingrid had become something unprecedented in the intelligence world. Former enemies who had chosen to trust each other completely. For the next 3 months, they would work together to document Nazi war crimes, protect witnesses, and ensure that evidence survived the chaos of Germany's eventual defeat. But their partnership would also force Margaret to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own methods and motivations. As the Allied advance accelerated and German resistance began to collapse, Margaret realized that she had become something she never intended to be, not just an intelligence operative, but an instrument of vengeance. The question was whether she could find her way back to being the person she had been before the war, or whether that person was gone forever. The final months of Margaret's war in Europe were unlike anything she could have anticipated. Working with Ingrid Richter had given her access to German intelligence networks that allowed them to stay ahead of both retreating German forces and advancing Allied units. They were operating in a strange twilight zone where traditional military authority had largely broken down, and individual initiative was often the only thing standing between order and complete chaos. Their most significant operation began in November 1944, when they learned that a group of high-ranking Nazi officials was attempting to destroy evidence of war crimes at a facility outside Munich. The facility contained detailed records of medical experiments, execution orders, and financial documents that showed how concentration camps had been funded and operated. More importantly, it housed the personal files of hundreds of Nazi officers who had participated in war crimes, but were now attempting to blend back into civilian life. Margaret and Ingrid spent 2 weeks infiltrating the facility, posing as German administrative personnel who had been assigned to help with the document destruction. What they discovered was even worse than they had expected. Not only were the Nazis destroying evidence of past crimes, but they were also implementing a plan that would allow many of the worst war criminals to escape prosecution by assuming new identities and fleeing to South America. The operation to preserve the documents required Margaret to make decisions that pushed her far beyond anything her OSS training had prepared her for. She couldn't simply steal the files. There were too many of them, and removing them would immediately alert the Germans that their security had been compromised. Instead, she had to find a way to photograph thousands of pages of documents while maintaining her cover and ensuring that both she and Ingrid could escape before their real identities were discovered. The solution came from an unexpected source. Ingrid's background in German intelligence had given her access to advanced photographic equipment that was far superior to anything the OSS had provided. Working in shifts over 3 nights, they managed to photograph nearly the entire archive, creating a complete record of Nazi war crimes that would later prove crucial in the Nuremberg trials and other post-war prosecutions. But their success came at a terrible personal cost. On their final night in the facility, they were discovered by a German security officer who recognized Ingrid from her previous assignments. What followed was a firefight that left 3 German soldiers dead and forced Margaret to kill someone for the first time since her initial landing in France. The young soldier she shot was probably no older than 17, and his final words were calling for his mother. The incident shattered something in Margaret that had been holding together throughout the war. She had killed enemy soldiers before, but always in situations where her own survival was immediately threatened. This time, she had killed someone who was essentially a child, simply because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had discovered her mission. The fact that the intelligence they had gathered would probably save thousands of lives didn't make the boy's death any easier to bear. Ingrid, who had seen Margaret maintain her composure through months of dangerous operations, was unprepared for the depth of Margaret's reaction to the killing. As they fled the facility with their precious intelligence, Margaret began to exhibit signs of what would later be recognized as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress. She became increasingly paranoid, had difficulty sleeping, and began to question not just her current mission, but everything she had done since arriving in France. The psychological breakdown came at the worst possible time. Allied forces were advancing rapidly toward the Rhine. German resistance was collapsing in some areas while becoming desperate and vicious in others, and Margaret's intelligence about war crimes and escaping Nazi officials was more valuable than ever. But she was becoming increasingly unreliable, making emotional decisions that endangered both her mission and the people she was working with. The crisis reached its peak when Margaret learned that Colonel Weber, the German officer she had negotiated with at the chemical weapons depot, had been captured by advancing Allied forces and was scheduled for interrogation about his knowledge of Nazi war crimes. Margaret knew that Weber had kept his word about the chemical weapons and had actually protected several French civilians during the German retreat. But she also knew that his testimony could implicate other German officers who deserved to be prosecuted for their crimes. Margaret's decision to attempt to influence Weber's interrogation revealed how far she had drifted from her original mission parameters. She abandoned her post, left Ingrid to complete their current assignment alone, and traveled nearly 200 miles through combat zones to reach the Allied facility where Weber was being held. Her plan was to ensure that Weber's testimony focused on the worst German war criminals, while protecting officers who had acted with some measure of humanity during the occupation. When Margaret finally reached the detention facility, she discovered that Weber had already been interrogated and had provided information that would lead to the prosecution of dozens of Nazi war criminals. But he had also been badly beaten during questioning, and it was clear that he was unlikely to survive much longer. Margaret spent several hours with him, ostensibly gathering additional intelligence, but actually trying to make sense of her own complicated feelings about enemy soldiers who had maintained some semblance of honor in a dishonorable war. Weber's final conversation with Margaret revealed something about both of their characters that neither had fully understood before. "You think you saved my soul by making me move those chemical weapons," he told her. "But the truth is, you gave me the chance to save yours. If you had forced me to use those weapons, you would have become something you could never have lived with. Sometimes the greatest victory is preventing your enemy from making you into someone you don't want to be." Weber died 3 days later, and Margaret was forced to confront the reality that the war had changed her in ways that might be irreversible. She had begun as an Iowa farm girl who wanted to serve her country, and she had become something far more complex, a person who understood that victory sometimes required compromises that were almost indistinguishable from defeat, and that the price of maintaining your humanity in wartime was often letting other people pay the cost of your moral decisions. When Margaret finally returned to Ingrid and resumed her official duties, she was a different person than she had been when the war started. She was still effective, still dedicated to completing her mission, but she now understood that the war would end eventually, and she would have to live with everything she had done in service of victory. The question that haunted her as Allied forces approached the German border was whether the person she had become was someone she could live with when the shooting stopped and the real accounting began. Margaret Sullivan returned to American soil in September 1945, for months after VE Day, carrying a briefcase full of commendations she couldn't talk about and memories of a war that officially never happened. The OSS was being dissolved, its operations classified at levels that would keep them secret for decades, and the young woman who had parachuted in a Nazi-occupied France was now expected to simply resume her life as if nothing had happened. The homecoming was surreal in ways that Margaret couldn't have anticipated. Her family threw a welcome party in their Iowa farmhouse, complete with yellow ribbons and apple pie, celebrating their daughter's service with Army intelligence in London. Margaret sat at the kitchen table where she had learned to speak French, surrounded by people who loved her but could never understand what she had actually experienced, and realized that the distance between her war and their war was unbridgeable. Her father, the World War I veteran who had taught her to shoot, was the only person who seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. Late one evening, as they sat on the front porch watching fireflies, he asked her a question that cut straight to the heart of her struggle. "Did you do things over there that you can't tell anyone about?" Margaret's response surprised them both. "Dad, I did things over there that I can't tell myself about." The transition to civilian life was brutally difficult. Margaret had been accepted to the University of Chicago on a full scholarship, ostensibly to study languages and international relations, but actually to begin what would become a career in intelligence analysis that would span the next 40 years. But first, she had to find a way to live with the person she had become during the war. The nightmares started almost immediately. Margaret would wake up in her childhood bedroom, reaching for weapons that weren't there, listening for sounds that indicated danger in a house that was perfectly safe. She would catch herself cataloging escape routes from her college classrooms and identifying potential surveillance in the local grocery store. Most disturbing of all, she began to realize that she missed the clarity and purpose that had defined her life behind enemy lines. The bureaucratic debriefing process was almost as traumatic as the war itself. For months, Margaret was required to meet with intelligence officers who wanted every detail of her operations, but who seemed incapable of understanding the psychological complexity of what she had experienced. They were particularly interested in her partnership with Ingrid Richter, which had violated virtually every protocol for intelligence operations, but had also produced some of the most valuable war crimes evidence in Allied possession. Margaret learned that Ingrid had also survived the war and was now working with American intelligence to identify Nazi war criminals who were attempting to escape prosecution. But their partnership, which had been born out of mutual respect and shared moral convictions, was now being analyzed as a potential security breach. Margaret was repeatedly questioned about Ingrid's motivations, her reliability, and whether their personal relationship had compromised either woman's judgment. The questions revealed something about the post-war intelligence community that Margaret found deeply troubling. The men who were now running American intelligence seemed incapable of understanding that people could be motivated by anything other than national loyalty or personal advancement. They couldn't comprehend that two women from opposing countries might have chosen to trust each other because they shared a commitment to something larger than their respective governments. Margaret's college years were marked by a profound sense of disconnection from her peers and their concerns. While her classmates worried about dating, grades, and career prospects, Margaret was secretly working as a translator and analyst for war crimes prosecutions. She spent her weekends reading testimony from concentration camp survivors and her evenings translating documents that detailed the industrial-scale murder of millions of people. She was 19 years old, and she knew things about human nature that most people never learn in a lifetime. The isolation was compounded by the fact that Margaret's war service was classified at such a high level that she couldn't even hint at what she had actually done. When people asked about her war experience, she was supposed to give vague answers about clerical work with Army intelligence. She watched as male veterans were celebrated for their service, while she had to pretend that her contribution had been minimal and unimportant. The psychological toll of maintaining this fiction was enormous. Margaret began to understand that she was experiencing something that wouldn't have an official name for another 30 years: post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1946, there was no support system for intelligence operatives dealing with the aftermath of covert operations, and certainly no recognition that young women might be suffering from combat-related psychological trauma. Margaret's salvation came from an unexpected source. During her junior year at Chicago, she was approached by a professor who had been quietly recruited to identify students who might be suitable for intelligence work. Professor James Morrison had been studying Margaret's academic performance and had noticed something unusual. Her papers on international relations showed an understanding of psychological warfare and intelligence operations that was far too sophisticated for someone whose only experience was supposed to be clerical work. Morrison's real assignment was to recruit the next generation of intelligence analysts for what would eventually become the CIA, but his conversation with Margaret revealed that she might be someone who could help solve a problem that was plaguing the entire intelligence community. The United States had won the war, but they were struggling to understand what they had created in the process. Intelligence operatives were returning from Europe and Asia with psychological trauma that the military didn't know how to treat, and many of them were having difficulty transitioning to peacetime intelligence work. Margaret's unique experience, as both an operative who had experienced extreme trauma and an analyst who understood the psychological dimensions of intelligence work, made her invaluable for developing new approaches to both training and supporting intelligence personnel. By her senior year, she was secretly working on some of the most sensitive projects in the early CIA, helping to create psychological evaluation procedures that would be used for decades. But her most important contribution came when she was asked to help interview other women who had served in intelligence roles during the war. Margaret discovered that there were hundreds of women who had served in positions similar to hers, and almost all of them were struggling with the same issues she faced: psychological trauma that couldn't be acknowledged, accomplishments that couldn't be discussed, and a sense of disconnection from society that had no idea what they had sacrificed. Working with these women gave Margaret a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt since the war ended. She began to understand that her experience, while traumatic, had also given her unique insights into human nature and international relations that could be valuable in peacetime. More importantly, she realized that her ability to survive behind enemy lines had been based on skills that were just as useful in peacetime intelligence work: the ability to read people, to understand complex motivations, and to make difficult decisions under pressure. By the time Margaret graduated from college in 1949, she had found her post-war mission. She would spend the next 4 decades working in intelligence analysis, psychological operations, and counterintelligence, using the skills she had learned in Nazi-occupied France to help America navigate the complexities of the Cold War. She would never again have to kill anyone, but she would continue to serve her country in ways that most people would never know about or understand. Years later, when young Navy SEAL Marcus Thompson made his sarcastic comment about which war she had been in, Margaret Sullivan was 87 years old and had been keeping secrets for more than 60 years. She had spent her entire adult life serving a country that could never officially acknowledge what she had done, working with people who had no idea of her real background, and living with memories that she could never fully share with anyone. But she had also earned something that Marcus Thompson, for all his training and accomplishments, hadn't yet learned to value: the knowledge that true service sometimes requires sacrificing not just your life, but your recognition, your comfort, and even your identity for something larger than yourself. She had earned the right to sit wherever she pleased, not because of what she had been given, but because of what she had given up. When she told Marcus to ask his granddad about Operation Jedburgh, she wasn't just referencing a military operation. She was challenging him to understand that heroism comes in many forms, and that some of the most important battles are fought by people who never get parades, never get medals that can be worn in public, and never get the chance to tell their stories at reunion dinners. Margaret Sullivan had spent her entire life proving that she belonged wherever she chose to be, and she was exactly where she belonged.